Imagine a young princess, born to a king desperate for a son, only to find herself declared illegitimate, her mother executed, and her very life often in peril. This was the crucible that forged Elizabeth Tudor, a woman who would rise from the shadows of persecution to become one of England's most iconic monarchs. Her path to the throne was fraught with danger, each moment a lesson in survival, shaping the cautious and pragmatic queen she would become. Hello, and thank you for joining this nighttime history journey. If you enjoy these long-form stories that you can simply listen to while you relax, work, or drive, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us and helps us create more content just like this. And for a bit of fun, drop a comment below and let us know how long you plan on listening with us. Are you settling in for the night or just starting a long drive? We love to hear from you. Now, let our story begin. The year is 1533. All of England holds its breath. King Henry VIII, a man whose will is as absolute as his power, has torn his country away from the Catholic Church, all for one reason: he needs a son, a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. His new queen, the clever and captivating Anne Boleyn, is pregnant. The court buzzes with anticipation. Astrologers predict a prince. The king is confident. But on September 7th, a baby is born, and it is a girl. They name her Elizabeth. For King Henry, this is not a blessing, but a bitter disappointment. His obsession for a son was not satisfied, and his love for Queen Anne began to cool almost immediately. For the first 2 years of her life, Elizabeth was a pampered princess, but she was living on borrowed time. The shadow of her father's disappointment loomed large. When Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her world shattered. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was accused of treason, adultery, and a host of other shocking crimes. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, a convenient way for the king to remove a wife he no longer wanted. In a swift and brutal move, Anne was taken to the Tower of London and executed. Imagine being that little girl. You wouldn't understand the politics, the accusations. All you would know is that one day your mother was the Queen of England, and the next, she was gone, erased. And with her mother's death, Elizabeth's status was erased too. An Act of Parliament declared her illegitimate, a bastard, removed from the line of succession. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth. She was simply the Lady Elizabeth, born into the glittering, yet perilous, world of the Tudor court. Elizabeth's arrival was initially a disappointment. Her early years were marked by the dramatic downfall of her mother, a traumatic event that stripped the young princess of her royal status and left her vulnerable. She was sent away from court, living in the households of others, a constant, awkward reminder of the king's failed marriage. But even in this political wilderness, one thing shone through Elizabeth's mind. She received a brilliant education, the kind usually reserved for princes. She learned to speak 6 languages fluently, studied history, philosophy, and theology. She developed a sharp intellect and a love of learning that would stay with her for her entire life. This education wasn't just for knowledge, it was for survival. She learned to be careful with her words, to watch, to listen, and to never reveal her true thoughts. Through the turbulent reigns of her siblings, Elizabeth learned the brutal realities of power. After her father Henry died, her younger half-brother, Edward VI, a devout Protestant, became king. For a time, her position was relatively safe, but Edward was a sickly boy, and his reign was short. When he died, the throne passed to Elizabeth's older half-sister, Mary, and with Mary's arrival, the danger to Elizabeth became immediate and terrifying. Mary was a fervent Catholic, determined to return England to the old faith. She saw her Protestant sister, who was popular with the people, as a threat, a natural rallying point for any rebellion. Mary became known as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, and Elizabeth lived under a cloud of constant suspicion. The breaking point came with Wyatt's rebellion, a Protestant uprising against Queen Mary. Though Elizabeth insisted she had nothing to do with it, her enemies at court claimed she was involved. On a cold, rainy day, Elizabeth was arrested and taken by boat to the very same place her mother had been imprisoned, the Tower of London. As she entered through the Traitor's Gate, she must have felt a chilling sense of history repeating itself. She was certain she was going to be executed. For months, she was held in the tower, interrogated relentlessly. She never broke. She used her sharp mind and her careful words to defend herself, denying any involvement in the plot. It was here, in the cold, damp stone rooms of the tower, that the future queen was truly forged. She learned that to survive, she had to be more clever, more cautious, and more controlled than anyone else. Under her half-sister, Mary, she endured imprisonment, suspicion, and the constant threat of execution, experiences that taught her caution, resilience, and the art of political survival. Eventually, with no concrete proof against her, Mary had to release her. But Elizabeth was kept under house arrest, watched day and night. She lived every moment knowing that one wrong word, one misplaced letter, could mean her death. Then, in November of 1558, everything changed. Queen Mary, childless and sick, died. The throne, by law, passed to the next in line. It passed to the 25-year-old woman who had been declared illegitimate, who had been imprisoned, who had lived in fear for so long. From the shadows of the tower, Elizabeth emerged as queen, a beacon of hope for a divided nation. The people of London rejoiced. Church bells rang. Bonfires were lit in the streets. They saw her as a fresh start, an end to the religious bloodshed. Her accession was met with popular acclaim. Yet the crown she inherited was burdened with religious schism, economic woes, and the ever-present question of her legitimacy and England's future. The young queen now faced a kingdom torn apart by religion, nearly bankrupt, and surrounded by powerful enemies. Elizabeth I had ascended to the throne, a survivor forged in the fires of adversity. But far to the north, in a kingdom deeply intertwined with England's fate, another queen, raised in stark contrast, was about to step onto the world stage. How would this other young queen, beautiful and fiercely Catholic, pose an existential threat to Elizabeth's newly established Protestant realm? The captivating, yet ultimately tragic, early life of Mary, Queen of Scots, was already in motion. Imagine a young queen, crowned in infancy, sent to the most glittering court in Europe, nurtured in luxury, and destined for a dazzling future. This was the life of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a stark contrast to her English cousin's arduous youth, raised amidst the opulence and fervent Catholicism of France. Mary embodied a dynastic threat that would haunt Elizabeth's reign for decades. While Elizabeth was learning to survive, Mary was learning to charm. She was born in a storm-swept Scottish palace in December 1542. Just 6 days later, her father, King James V of Scotland, died. Some say of a broken heart after a devastating military defeat. With his dying breath, he is said to have whispered about the crown. It came with a lass, and it will pass with a lass. That lass was his newborn daughter, now Mary, Queen of Scots. A baby with a crown on her head is a tempting prize. The powerful king, Henry VIII of England, immediately sought to have her married to his own son, Edward, to unite the two kingdoms under English rule. But Mary's mother, the French noblewoman Mary of Guise, had other plans. She was fiercely Catholic and deeply loyal to France. To protect her daughter from the English and to secure Scotland's alliance with France, she made a bold decision. At just 5 years old, little Queen Mary was put on a ship and sent to the safety and splendor of the French court. Born to a crown in Scotland, Mary's childhood unfolded not in her rugged homeland, but amidst the unparalleled splendor of the French court. There, she blossomed into a captivating young woman, steeped in Catholic tradition and surrounded by the grand ambitions of her formidable Guise relatives. She grew up alongside the royal children of France, receiving the finest education possible. She was tall for her time, graceful, with auburn hair and sparkling eyes. She spoke multiple languages, wrote poetry, played music, and learned to navigate the intricate politics of the most powerful court in Europe. She was adored, pampered, and prepared for one destiny: to become the Queen of France. At the age of 15, that destiny was fulfilled. She married the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Francis. It was a spectacular wedding, a union of crowns that promised a powerful Franco-Scottish future. But across the Channel in England, Queen Mary I was dying. When she passed in 1558 and Elizabeth took the throne, the French court saw an opportunity. In their Catholic eyes, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was illegitimate. The true heir, they argued, was Mary Stuart. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, a direct, legitimate descendant. And so, Mary and Francis made a fateful, provocative decision. They began to use the royal coat of arms of England, quartering it with their own. It was a public, unmistakable declaration. They were not just King and Queen of France and Scotland. They were claiming to be the rightful King and Queen of England as well. This act was a direct challenge, a slap in the face to the new Queen Elizabeth. It was a shadow that would fall over their relationship forever. For a fleeting, dazzling period, Mary held the crowns of both France and Scotland, and publicly asserted her claim to England's throne, a direct challenge to her cousin Elizabeth. Her husband Francis became King of France, and for a glorious 17 months, Mary was queen of 2 nations. But fate can be fickle, and the early death of her young husband stripped her of one crown, forcing her gaze homeward. Francis, always a frail young man, died suddenly. At just 18 years old, Mary was a widow. Her position in France, once so secure, evaporated overnight. The power now rested with her formidable mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, who had little use for a Scottish queen dowager. Mary's golden youth was over. She had no choice but to return to Scotland. From the lavish Catholic courts of France, Mary returned to a Scotland transformed, a rugged land, now fiercely Protestant, governed by stern lords. The country she had left as a child was gone. In her absence, a fiery preacher named John Knox had led a successful Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Mass was outlawed. The Scottish nobility had seized power, and now their Catholic queen, raised in the luxury of France, was coming home. The stage was set for an immediate clash of wills, faith, and political realities, far different from the sun-drenched halls of her youth. 2 queens, shaped by vastly different worlds, now stood at the head of their respective kingdoms. One, cautious and pragmatic, ruling a newly Protestant England. The other, charming and impetuous, a Catholic queen in a Protestant Scotland, openly laying claim to her cousin's throne. The stage was set for a rivalry born of blood, faith, and the very concept of legitimate rule. Their relationship would begin with letters, gifts, and talk of friendship. An uneasy dance between two powerful women who knew, deep down, that only one could ultimately prevail. They never met, these two iconic queens, yet their lives were irrevocably intertwined. For years, the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary was a delicate dance of diplomacy and distrust, a complex ballet performed across borders, mediated by letters and emissaries. It was a relationship defined by a shared royal bloodline, but constantly overshadowed by religious divides and the looming question of who truly had the better claim to England's crown. This uneasy dance began the moment Mary returned to Scotland. In England, Elizabeth moved swiftly to calm the religious storms that had battered her country. She established what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It was a masterclass in political compromise. She created a Protestant Church of England, but it was a moderate one, keeping some of the familiar ceremonies of the old faith. Her goal wasn't to satisfy the most extreme Protestants or the most devout Catholics, but to find a middle way that the majority of her people could accept. It was a practical solution from a pragmatic queen. Mary, however, was not a pragmatist. She was a woman of passionate belief. When she returned to Scotland, she was immediately presented with the Treaty of Edinburgh. This treaty, signed by her representatives while she was in France, had one crucial clause. It required her to officially renounce her claim to the English throne. To Elizabeth, this was a simple, necessary step for peace. To Mary, it was unthinkable. Her claim was her birthright, her most powerful political card. She refused to sign, and so the letter-writing began. Their correspondence is fascinating. On the surface, it's full of flourishes and affection. They call each other dear sister and good cousin. They exchanged portraits and gifts. But underneath the polite language, it was a high-stakes negotiation. Elizabeth constantly pushed Mary to ratify the treaty. Mary constantly dodged, offering friendship and love, but never giving up her claim. The early years were a study in polite tension. Elizabeth, securing her realm with a Protestant settlement, repeatedly sought Mary's recognition. Mary, however, clung to her claim, a glittering prize that she believed was hers by divine right, setting the foundation for years of unresolved conflict. Nothing exposed this tension more than the question of Mary's marriage. As a young widowed queen, everyone in Europe knew she would remarry, and who she married was a matter of international importance. If she married a powerful Spanish or French prince, it would create a Catholic powerhouse alliance that could threaten England directly. Elizabeth was determined to prevent this. In a strange and calculating move, Elizabeth tried to control the situation. She proposed one of her own English noblemen as a husband for Mary, none other than her own personal favorite. Some said her secret love, Robert Dudley. From Elizabeth's point of view, it was a clever move. If Mary married an Englishman loyal to her, the threat would be contained. Mary, understandably, was insulted. She saw it as an attempt to make her a puppet, so she made her own choice, a choice that would prove disastrous. She fell for her cousin, a tall, handsome young man named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. On the surface, he seemed perfect. He was a Scottish noble, and he was Catholic. But there was another crucial detail. Through his mother, Darnley also had a claim to the English throne. He was a Tudor descendant, just like Mary. By marrying him, Mary wasn't just choosing a husband. She was strengthening her own family's claim to the English crown, creating a potential dynasty that could challenge Elizabeth's. When Elizabeth heard the news, she was furious. She saw it as a direct act of defiance. The question of Mary's hand became a political weapon. Elizabeth desperately sought to control her cousin's marital destiny, fearing a foreign Catholic alliance. But Mary, in a bold and defiant move, chose Darnley, a union that further solidified her claim and ignited Elizabeth's profound distrust. This marriage sent a signal to all the disgruntled Catholics in England. For them, Elizabeth was a heretic and a usurper. Mary, now married to another Catholic claimant, became an even more powerful symbol of the true faith. Whispers of plots began to circulate in the courts of Europe. Spanish ambassadors and English Catholic exiles started scheming. They saw Mary as the key to overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholicism to England. For Elizabeth's chief minister, the ever-watchful William Cecil, these whispers were a constant source of anxiety. He saw Mary not as a cousin or even a rival queen, but as a magnet for treason. He built a network of spies across the continent, intercepting letters, listening to gossip, and watching every move Mary made. To Cecil and the English government, Mary's very existence was a threat. Even in these early years, Mary became the undeniable focal point for Catholic discontent and plots against Elizabeth. Though often indirect, the sheer potential of Mary as a rival queen cast a long, chilling shadow over Elizabeth's reign. The uneasy peace between the cousins was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by religious zealots and political schemers. But Mary's personal life, her fateful marriage to Lord Darnley, was about to descend into a vortex of scandal and violence. Events so shocking they would shatter her reign in Scotland and ultimately deliver her into Elizabeth's unwilling custody. What terrible tragedies would befall Mary, forcing her to seek refuge with the very cousin she claimed to outrank? Her seemingly brilliant political move was about to become her undoing. While Elizabeth carefully cultivated her image of the Virgin Queen, a symbol of stability and control, Mary Stuart's personal life in Scotland spiraled into a devastating melodrama. A series of sensational scandals, murders, and betrayals that would cost her not only her throne, but her very freedom. The recklessness that defined Mary's romantic choices would ultimately prove to be her undoing, delivering her directly into the hands of her long-standing rival. Her marriage to Lord Darnley, the union that so infuriated Elizabeth, quickly turned toxic. The handsome, charming cousin she had married revealed himself to be arrogant, ambitious, and a violent drunk. He was jealous of his wife's power and demanded that she make him a king in his own right, not just her husband. Mary refused. Darnley's resentment grew into a dangerous paranoia, and he focused his hatred on one man, David Rizzio. Rizzio was Mary's Italian private secretary. He was intelligent, cultured, and one of the Queen's closest friends and confidants. The Scottish nobles, a rough and ruthless bunch, despised him as a foreign upstart with too much influence. Darnley, in his jealousy, convinced them that Rizzio had to go. One night in March 1566, a group of armed lords, led by a furious Darnley, burst into the Queen's private chambers at Holyrood Palace. Mary, 6 months pregnant, was having supper with Rizzio and a few ladies-in-waiting. They dragged the screaming secretary from the Queen's side, ignoring her pleas. They stabbed him over 50 times, leaving his body in a bloody heap just outside her door. It was a message sent in the most brutal way imaginable. This horrifying act, orchestrated by her own husband, traumatized Mary and shattered any remaining affection she had for him. The marriage was now a nightmare of mutual distrust. 10 months later, that nightmare reached its grim conclusion. Lord Darnley was staying at a small house just outside Edinburgh called Kirkhofield, recovering from an illness. In the dead of night, a massive explosion ripped the house apart. The blast was heard for miles. When people rushed to the scene, they found the building reduced to rubble. But strangely, Darnley's body, along with that of his servant, was found in the garden nearby. There wasn't a mark on him from the explosion. He had been strangled. Who did it? Suspicion immediately fell upon a powerful, ambitious, and reckless nobleman, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. And chillingly, suspicion also fell on the Queen herself. Did she know about the plot? Was she involved? Her actions in the following weeks did nothing to help her case. She showed little public grief for her murdered husband, and she grew alarmingly close to the man everyone believed was the killer. The explosion at Kirkhofield and the subsequent discovery of Darnley's body ignited a firestorm of suspicion around Mary. Then came the final, shocking act. Just a few months after Darnley's murder, Mary was allegedly abducted by Bothwell and his men. Many believed she went willingly. Shortly after, she married him, a Catholic queen, marrying the Protestant man widely believed to have murdered her last husband. It was a scandal that horrified Scotland and all of Europe. Her subsequent rapid marriage to Bothwell sealed her fate in the eyes of many, leading to outrage and rebellion. The Scottish nobles, outraged, had finally had enough. They rose up in rebellion, not just against Bothwell, but against their queen. The two armies met at a place called Carberry Hill, but there was no real battle. Mary's forces deserted her. To save Bothwell's life, she surrendered herself to the rebel lords. They took her to a castle fortress in the middle of a lake, Loch Leven, and imprisoned her. There, facing threats against her life, she was forced to sign a piece of paper giving up her throne. Her new king was her own son, the infant James. But Mary's story wasn't over. In a daring escape, she disguised herself and was rowed across the lake to freedom. She quickly raised another army, but her luck had run out. At the Battle of Langside, her forces were decisively crushed. Her defeat was total. She was a queen with no kingdom, a fugitive in her own land. Panicked and desperate, she made one last, fateful decision. She rowed south, crossing the border into England, and threw herself on the mercy of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. Her desperate escape and final defeat left her with only one recourse: to seek refuge in the kingdom of her rival, Elizabeth. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived on English soil not as a queen, but as a fugitive, seeking help from the very cousin she had openly challenged for the throne. Elizabeth now faced an agonizing dilemma: help her cousin reclaim her throne, which would empower a Catholic rival, or hold her prisoner, which would be an unprecedented act against an anointed queen. The next 2 decades of their lives would be defined by this profound, dangerous decision. The guest had become the prisoner. Mary Stuart's arrival in England presented Elizabeth with a dilemma of unprecedented scale. To simply return her to Scotland would risk strengthening a dangerous rival. To help her regain her throne would empower a Catholic queen. The answer Elizabeth chose, born of pragmatism and fear, was to hold Mary prisoner. This decision, fraught with moral and political hazard, would define their relationship for the next 19 years, turning Mary into a living symbol for all who sought to overthrow England's Protestant queen. Think of the position Elizabeth was in. Here was her cousin, an anointed queen, a woman who had once claimed her own throne, now standing on her shores as a refugee, begging for help. The rules of hospitality, of kinship, of royal honor, all suggested Elizabeth should aid her. But Elizabeth was not just a cousin. She was a queen, responsible for the safety of her nation. Her council, led by the cautious William Cecil, saw Mary's arrival not as a family matter, but as a national emergency. Mary was more than just a Catholic. She was, to many, the legitimate Catholic heir to the English throne. For the thousands of English Catholics who resented Elizabeth's Protestant rule, Mary was a living, breathing alternative. For the powerful Catholic kings of Spain and France, she was a potential pawn, a figurehead they could support to destabilize England from within. Elizabeth found herself caught in an agonizing bind. To release Mary was to unleash a potent threat. To hold her captive was an act that defied royal norms. Ultimately, the survival of her Protestant realm outweighed the claims of kinship, leading to Mary's long, bitter imprisonment. To justify this unprecedented act, Elizabeth's government needed to prove that Mary was unfit to rule. The Scottish lords who had overthrown Mary were happy to provide the evidence. They arrived in England carrying a small silver casket, a wedding gift from Mary to her first husband, Francis. Inside this casket, they claimed, were a series of letters and sonnets written by Mary to the Earl of Babington. These became known as the casket letters. If they were genuine, they were damning. They appeared to show Mary not only deeply in love with Bothwell, but actively plotting the murder of her husband, Darnley. A conference was held to examine the evidence. Mary, refusing to recognize the authority of an English court, did not attend. The letters were presented. Were they real? Were they clever forgeries? To this day, historians debate their authenticity. But for Elizabeth's government, it didn't really matter. The infamous casket letters, though their authenticity remains debated, served a crucial purpose. They provided Elizabeth and her council with the pretext to keep Mary in perpetual custody. The accusations of regicide tarnished Mary's reputation, ensuring she remained a political prisoner rather than a reigning queen. Mary was moved from castle to castle across the English countryside, always under guard, always watched. She was a queen without a kingdom, living in a gilded cage, but her power as a symbol only grew. She became the sun around which all Catholic plots against Elizabeth revolved. Year after year, Mary, even in captivity, remained the irresistible magnet for Catholic conspiracies. The first major one was the Ridolfi Plot in 1571. An Italian banker named Roberto Ridolfi concocted a scheme to have an English duke, the Duke of Norfolk, marry Mary. Then, a Spanish army would invade, Elizabeth would be overthrown, and Mary and Norfolk would take the throne as Catholic monarchs. The plot was discovered by Elizabeth's new spymaster, the grim and brilliant Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was a puritanical Protestant who saw Mary as the root of all England's problems. He built the most sophisticated spy network in Europe to protect his queen. The Ridolfi Plot was smashed, and the Duke of Norfolk was executed for treason, but the threat remained. A decade later came the Throckmorton Plot. This time, the plan was for a French force to invade, supported by Spanish money, to free Mary and put her on the throne. Once again, Walsingham's spies uncovered the conspiracy. The Spanish ambassador was expelled from England. Each plot that was foiled only served to increase the pressure on Elizabeth. Her counselors, her parliament, the Protestant public. They all saw Mary as a viper in their midst. They begged Elizabeth to take decisive action, to end the threat once and for all. But Elizabeth hesitated. To execute an anointed queen, her own cousin, was a line she was not yet willing to cross. From the Ridolfi plot to the Throckmorton plot, a relentless stream of schemes aimed to depose Elizabeth and enthrone Mary, escalating the danger and tightening the chains around the Scottish queen. For 19 long years, Mary remained a royal prisoner, a constant, living threat to Elizabeth's crown and life. But the stakes were about to be raised dramatically. A final, audacious plot involving coded letters and the meticulous work of Elizabeth's speechmaster would finally provide the irrefutable evidence needed to seal Mary's tragic fate. The question was no longer if Mary was involved, but how Elizabeth would bring herself to sign the death warrant of an anointed queen. Our next chapter unveils the intricate trap that led to Mary's undoing, the Babington Plot. For years, Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had painstakingly woven a vast, invisible web of intelligence, tracking every whisper of rebellion, every potential threat to the Queen's life. He knew Mary, Queen of Scots, was a magnet for conspiracy, but needed irrefutable proof of her direct involvement. The stage was now set for the ultimate trap, the ingenious, yet morally ambiguous Babington Plot. Sir Francis Walsingham was not a man to be trifled with. He was a devout, unsmiling Protestant who had seen the horrors of Catholic persecution firsthand during his time in exile. To him, the fight against Catholicism was not just politics. It was a battle for England's soul, and at the heart of the Catholic threat, he saw one person, Mary Stuart. His loyalty to Elizabeth was absolute, and he was determined to protect her by any means necessary. Hidden in plain sight, Walsingham built an espionage machine unlike any before it. His network stretched across Europe, a complex system of paid informers, double agents, and brilliant codebreakers. He had spies in the French court, in the heart of Rome, and in the Spanish embassy in London. Nothing happened without him knowing about it. His one great frustration was that for nearly 2 decades, while plot after plot swirled around Mary, he could never find the final, undeniable proof that she was personally involved in planning to kill Queen Elizabeth. He knew Mary was at the heart of it all, but merely suspicion was not enough. He needed undeniable proof. He needed to catch her in the act. So he decided to build a trap. The bait for this trap was a young man named Anthony Babington. Babington was a wealthy, idealistic Catholic gentleman. He saw Queen Elizabeth as a heretic and Mary as England's rightful, suffering queen. He dreamed of being the one to free her, to restore the true faith, and to go down in history as a hero. He and a group of other young, zealous Catholics began to hatch a conspiracy. Their plan was simple and deadly. 6 of them would assassinate Queen Elizabeth, and at the same time, a foreign invasion, funded by Spain, would land in England to put Mary on the throne. It was exactly the kind of plot Walsingham had been waiting for. But instead of simply arresting Babington, Walsingham did something far more clever and far more sinister. He let the plot continue. Babington, desperate to get Mary's blessing for his plan, found what he thought was a secret, foolproof way to communicate with her. A local brewer who delivered beer to Chartley Hall, where Mary was being held, agreed to smuggle letters back and forth, hidden in the hollow bung of a beer barrel. What Babington didn't know was that the brewer was one of Walsingham's agents. Every single letter that went into that beer barrel, and every letter that came out, was first taken to London. There, in a secret office, Walsingham's team carefully broke the seals, copied the letters, and then handed them to his master codebreaker, a man named Thomas Phillips. Phillips deciphered the complex codes, revealing every detail of the plot. The letters were then resealed with a forged seal and sent on their way. Mary and Babington thought their conversations were secret. In reality, Walsingham was reading their mail. The Babington Plot began as a desperate hope for Catholic restoration, led by a fervent young man. But unknown to him, every coded message, every clandestine meeting, was being meticulously observed and recorded by Walsingham's unseen network. The trap was sprung when Babington sent the most critical letter of all. In it, he laid out the entire plan in explicit detail. The dispatch of the usurper, he called it, meaning the murder of Elizabeth. All of Walsingham's spies held their breath. Would Mary take the bait? For days they waited. Then a reply came from Mary's pen. Phillips quickly deciphered it. It was the moment Walsingham had worked towards for years. In the letter, Mary gave her full support to the plot. She blessed their enterprise and agreed to the plan to assassinate her cousin. Walsingham had her to make the case even stronger. He had Phillips forge a postscript onto the letter, a little P.S. asking Babington for the names of the 6 men who would carry out the assassination. Babington, foolishly, sent back their names. The smoking gun had arrived. Mary's explicit approval of Elizabeth's assassination, meticulously deciphered by Walsingham's cryptographers. This single, damning letter provided the irrefutable evidence the spymaster had so long sought. He took the bundle of deciphered letters and laid them before Queen Elizabeth. There was no more ambiguity, no more suspicion. Here was proof. In Mary's own words, the net had finally closed. Mary, Queen of Scots, after 19 years of captivity and countless plots, was now undeniably implicated in a conspiracy to murder an anointed queen. The evidence was overwhelming, and the demand for justice would be deafening. How would Elizabeth, so long hesitant, bring herself to condemn her own cousin, a fellow queen, to the scaffold? Our next chapter details the dramatic trial that sealed Mary's fate. To put an anointed queen on trial for treason was an unprecedented act, fraught with legal and political peril. Yet, with the damning evidence of the Babington Plot in hand, Elizabeth's government felt it had no choice. At Fothering Castle, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. Mary, Queen of Scots, defiant and eloquent, facing her accusers in a trial that would decide not just her fate, but the very limits of royal power. The news of the plot sent shockwaves through England. This wasn't just another vague conspiracy. The trial itself was a legal and political minefield. Mary was brought before the commission, a lone woman, dressed in black, facing a sea of stern male faces. Her first act was to challenge the entire proceeding. She stood and declared, "I am a queen, and I am not subject to the laws of England. I will not betray the dignity of my rank, nor the rights of my son, by submitting to your judgment." She argued that as a sovereign queen, anointed by God, no earthly court had the right to judge her. The English prosecutors countered that, by living in England and plotting against its monarch, she was subject to its laws. For 2 days, she refused to participate. Finally, she was persuaded that to not defend herself would be seen as an admission of guilt. She agreed to attend, but under protest, never accepting the court's legitimacy. The prosecution laid out its case. It was overwhelming. They presented the letters, the copies of Mary's coded messages to Babington, and his replies. They presented the confessions of Babington and the other conspirators, who had already been caught and executed. They showed how Mary had blessed the plan to murder Elizabeth. The evidence, painstakingly gathered by Walsingham's network, was meticulous and damning. The deciphered letters, Mary's own words, painted a clear picture of complicity in a plot against Elizabeth's life and throne. Despite the crushing weight of the evidence, Mary mounted a remarkable defense. She had no lawyer, no one to speak for her. She had to defend herself, and she did so with intelligence, fire, and dignity. She stood before these powerful men and picked their case apart. She claimed the letters were forgeries. "Could I not be an enemy to Queen Elizabeth?" she asked, "without being a conspirator against her life?" She argued that Walsingham and his spies had entrapped her, luring her into a plot they themselves had encouraged. She pointed out that she was denied the right to see the original letters or to cross-examine any witnesses. She was, she declared, a lone woman in a foreign country, with no one to advise her, facing a court that had already decided her guilt. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Mary, regal and defiant, launched a powerful defense. She challenged the authenticity of the letters, accused her accusers of treachery, and asserted her fundamental right as a sovereign queen, never truly wavering in her conviction. But it was no use. The evidence of the letters, whether entrapped or not, was too strong. After a short deliberation, the commissioners returned their verdict. They found Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, guilty of imagining and compassing the death of Queen Elizabeth. The sentence was death. Parliament ratified the verdict and formally petitioned Elizabeth to carry out the execution immediately for the safety of the realm. The verdict was inevitable, guilty. But the condemnation of an anointed queen was one thing. Securing Elizabeth's signature on the death warrant was another entirely. For months, the two queens, though separated by prison walls, would engage in a final, agonizing struggle of wills. How would Elizabeth, plagued by conscience and political pressure, ultimately decide the fate of her cousin? Our next chapter explores Elizabeth's profound moral and political dilemma. The verdict was clear, the danger undeniable. Yet Elizabeth I hesitated. To sign the death warrant of Mary, Queen of Scots, was to commit an act that few monarchs dared contemplate, the execution of an anointed sovereign. It plunged Elizabeth into a deep, agonizing dilemma, caught between the demands of her parliament, the council of her ministers, and the profound moral implications of regicide. For weeks, England held its breath. Parliament was in an uproar. They presented petition after petition to the Queen, begging her to sign the warrant. They delivered fiery speeches, warning of the dire consequences if Mary were allowed to live. Every day she survived, they argued, was another day Elizabeth's own life was in peril. What if another plot succeeded? What if the Spanish invaded in her name? The public, whipped into a frenzy by Protestant preachers, shared this fear. They saw Mary as the devil incarnate, the source of all England's troubles. A chorus of voices, from Parliament to her most trusted advisers, clamored for Mary's execution. The safety of the realm, the very life of the Queen, they argued, depended on the removal of this perpetual threat. But Elizabeth, uniquely, understood the profound implications of their demands. While her counselors saw only political necessity, Elizabeth saw something more. She was a queen. She believed, as all monarchs did, in the divine right of kings. A monarch was chosen by God, their person sacred, to execute a fellow queen, even one who had plotted against you, was to break that sacred trust. It set a terrifying precedent. If her subjects could execute a queen for treason, what was to stop them from one day executing her? She also feared the international reaction. What would France do? What would Spain do? What would Mary's own son, King James of Scotland, do? Would this finally be the act that triggered a massive Catholic crusade against England? And perhaps, deep down, there was a flicker of personal feeling. This was her cousin, her own blood. For all the years of rivalry and distrust, they were family. The psychological weight of this decision was immense. Elizabeth fell into a state of deep melancholy. She raged at her counselors, accusing them of forcing her hand. She wept in private. She was described as being tormented, pacing her chambers day and night, unable to eat or sleep. "I am not a cruel person," she reportedly said. "I do not want her blood." Elizabeth wrestled with her conscience, torn between political necessity and the sanctity of royal blood. To execute an anointed queen, even a rival, was to challenge the very principle that legitimized her own reign. The burden of this decision weighed heavily upon her, leaving her almost paralyzed by inner turmoil. Her ministers, led by the pragmatic Lord Burleigh and the determined Walsingham, would not let her rest. They brought her news of fresh plots, of Spanish ships gathering, of Catholic agents lurking in London. They painted a picture of imminent danger. They argued that her hesitation was putting the entire kingdom at risk. They left the death warrant on her desk, a constant, silent accusation. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, after months of agonizing indecision, she broke. Her secretary, William Davison, brought the warrant to her again. She took a pen, and with a flourish, she signed her name, Elizabeth R. As soon as she did it, she seemed to regret it. She reportedly told Davison not to have the Great Seal of England affixed to it immediately, a sign of her continued hesitation. But her counselors knew their queen. They knew she might change her mind again. They took the signed warrant and, without telling her, immediately had it sealed and dispatched. Under relentless pressure, Elizabeth finally yielded. With a heavy heart and trembling hand, she signed the fateful document, unleashing a chain of events that would end Mary's life, but also seal her own place in history as the monarch who dared to execute a queen. The death warrant was signed, a grim journey now set in motion for Mary, Queen of Scots. She had faced plots, imprisonment, and trial, but now the ultimate fate awaited her. How would the proud, defiant queen meet her end, and what dramatic scenes would unfold on the scaffold at Fothering Castle? Our next chapter bears witness to the final, tragic moments of Mary Stuart. The morning of February 8th, 1587, dawned cold and bleak at Fothering Castle. For 19 years, Mary, Queen of Scots, had lived as a royal prisoner, a pawn in a deadly game. Now, her long, tumultuous life was to reach its final, brutal conclusion. She would meet her fate with a dignity and defiance that would forever cement her image as a martyr in the eyes of her supporters. They told her she was to be executed the following morning at 8 o'clock. Mary received the news not with fear, but with a calm that seemed to unnerve them. She had been expecting this for months, for years even. She simply thanked them for the news, stating that she was ready to die and welcomed the end of her long suffering. In her final hours, Mary embraced her destiny with a serene composure. But in careful preparation, she wrote letters, one to the King of France, one to her family. She meticulously divided her personal belongings, her jewels, and her money among her small, loyal household of servants who wept around her. She comforted them, telling them to rejoice, for her suffering was almost over. For her final act, she chose her attire with immense care. She would wear a dress of black velvet, a somber and regal choice, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. She was not just preparing for death, she was preparing for her role in history. At 8 in the morning, there was a knock on her door. It was time. Holding a crucifix in one hand and a prayer book in the other, Mary walked with a steady royal gait from her chambers. The great hall of the castle had been transformed. At its center stood a large wooden stage, draped in black cloth. On the stage was a cushioned stool, and next to it the executioner's block, also covered in black. Around the hall, some 300 witnesses, local gentry and officials, had been assembled to watch. With a regal bearing, Mary stepped onto the scaffold, the very picture of defiance. She looked out at the silent crowd. The Dean of Peterborough, a Protestant clergyman, stepped forward to offer her religious comfort. Mary waved him away. "I was born in the Catholic faith," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and in that faith I will die." As the dean began to pray loudly in English, Mary knelt and began her own prayers in Latin, her ladies sobbing beside her. When she was finished, she stood. In a final address, she forgave her executioners and proclaimed her innocence of any plot against Elizabeth's life, praying for the Queen and for England. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, were a powerful testament to her unshakable Catholic faith, delivered before the somber eyes of her executioners. Then, her two ladies-in-waiting stepped forward to help her disrobe. As they removed her black outer gown, a gasp went through the room. There she stood, revealed in the deep crimson of a martyr. It was a final, silent, and powerful statement. She turned to the masked executioner and said, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Her ladies blindfolded her with a white cloth embroidered with gold. She knelt down, placed her head upon the small block, and stretched out her arms. But the horror was not yet over. The executioner, perhaps nervous, missed his mark. The first blow struck the back of her head, and Mary let out a low groan. The second blow did not fully sever the neck. It took a third, gruesome strike to finally complete the terrible task. The executioner then picked up the head to show it to the crowd, shouting the traditional words, "God save Queen Elizabeth." But as he held it aloft, another shock went through the room. Mary's auburn hair was a wig. The head, with its wig now fallen away, revealed her own hair, short and shockingly gray. And, as if the scene were not poignant enough, her little Skye Terrier, which had been hiding in the folds of her crimson skirt, ran out, whimpering, and lay down in the growing pool of her blood, refusing to be parted from its mistress. But even in death, Mary surprised those present, leaving behind a poignant image that would forever fuel the legend of the martyred queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, was dead, her execution a shocking, momentous event that reverberated across Europe. How would the world react to this unprecedented act, and what new, terrifying threat would emerge from Catholic Europe in the wake of Mary's death? Our next chapter explores the immediate fallout and the approach of the Spanish Armada. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, sent shockwaves across Europe. For Catholic powers, especially Spain, it was the final outrage, a blasphemous act against an anointed queen, leading to one of the most famous naval confrontations in history, the Spanish Armada, a direct reckoning for Elizabeth's daring act. When Queen Elizabeth learned that her council had dispatched the death warrant without her final, explicit command, she flew into a rage. She banished Lord Burleigh from her sight, and had her secretary, Davison, thrown into the Tower of London, a way to distance herself from the grim reality of regicide. We will never know for sure, but it mattered little to the rest of Europe. The fact remained: a Catholic queen had been executed by a Protestant one. Mary's blood cried out for vengeance across the continent. Nowhere was the fury greater than in Spain. King Philip II, the most powerful man in the world, and the self-proclaimed champion of the Catholic faith, had long seen England as a heretical thorn in his side. Mary's death gave him the perfect excuse. It was no longer just a political war. It was now a holy crusade. He would avenge the martyred queen, depose the heretic Elizabeth, and forcibly return England to the Catholic Church. Philip now had the moral impetus he needed to launch his long-awaited enterprise, a massive invasion designed to crush Protestant England. The greatest fleet the world had ever seen was assembled. They called it the Grande Armada, the great and most fortunate navy. We know it as the Invincible Armada. The plan was audacious. This floating city of warships would sail up the English Channel, link up with the elite Spanish army stationed in the Netherlands under the command of the Duke of Parma, and then ferry this unstoppable force across the sea for a full-scale invasion of England. Its very approach struck terror into the hearts of many in England, fearing the utter destruction of their nation. In England's darkest hour, Elizabeth's leadership shone brightest. As the Armada sailed closer, she traveled to the coast at Tilbury, where her army was gathered to repel the expected invasion. Dressed in a silver breastplate over a white velvet gown, she rode on a white horse among her soldiers and delivered one of the most famous speeches in English history. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she declared, her voice ringing with passion, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." Out at sea, the English fleet, though much smaller, was ready. Led by brilliant commanders like Sir Francis Drake, they had a crucial advantage. Their ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the huge Spanish galleons. They could dance around the Spanish fleet, firing their long-range cannons, and then darting away before the Spanish could get close enough to board them. In a stroke of genius, Drake sent 8 of his own ships, packed with flammable material and set ablaze, drifting towards the anchored Spanish fleet. These were the fire ships. The Spanish panicked. To escape the flames, their captains cut their anchor cables. They were now scattered and vulnerable. Then the weather turned. A powerful gale, what the English would later call the Protestant wind, blew the scattered Spanish ships northwards into the treacherous waters of the North Sea, battered by storms. With their anchors gone, many ships were wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The mighty Armada was crippled, not so much by English cannons, but by English tactics and the power of nature. Elizabeth's inspiring words, combined with the daring tactics of her naval commanders and the timely intervention of nature, miraculously repelled the seemingly invincible Spanish fleet, securing England's Protestant future. The defeat of the Spanish Armada cemented Elizabeth's Protestant reign and her legendary status, a direct consequence of the ultimate decision she made regarding Mary. Yet, even with her greatest rival gone and England saved from invasion, The long shadow of succession and the personal cost of her choices would continue to shape Elizabeth's final years. What lasting impact did this bitter rivalry have on England and on Elizabeth herself? Our next chapter explores the twilight of the Tudor era. With the threat of the Spanish Armada vanquished and her most dangerous rival silenced, Elizabeth I entered a period of unprecedented stability and flourishing. This was the dawn of England's Golden Age, a time when exploration, literature, and political consolidation reached new heights, largely driven by the unwavering hand of the Virgin Queen. It was a testament to her resilience and the strength of the nation she had so carefully guided. The victory over the Armada did more than just save England from invasion. It created a powerful sense of national pride and unity. For decades, Elizabeth had walked a tightrope, balancing the factions at her court, managing religious division, and fending off foreign threats. Now, with her greatest external and internal threats eliminated, she could finally preside over a kingdom that felt secure in itself. Having weathered the storms of succession and invasion, Elizabeth consolidated her power, relying on a trusted inner circle. Her entire reign had been shaped by the counsel of men like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, her steady, cautious, and loyal chief advisor. He was the anchor of her government, a man who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep the ship of state afloat. And there was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend and the great love of her life. Though their relationship was always complex, and they never married, his devotion to her was a constant source of support until his death shortly after the Armada. Elizabeth was a master at managing people. She skillfully handled her parliament, knowing when to charm, when to command, and when to compromise, always fiercely protecting her royal authority while building a consensus for her policies. Her long reign brought a newfound political stability, guiding England through a period of immense change with shrewd and often subtle diplomacy. Beyond politics, Elizabeth's reign witnessed an astonishing cultural awakening. The confidence and security of the era unleashed a torrent of creativity. It was a time of poets and playwrights, of music and new ideas. On the stages of London, in theaters like the Globe, the genius of William Shakespeare was redefining what was possible in storytelling. His plays, histories, comedies, and tragedies weren't just entertainment. They captured the spirit of the age, exploring the complexities of power, love, and human nature. He was not alone. Playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and poets like Edmund Spenser created works that are still celebrated today. The stages of London came alive, and new ideas permeated society, marking a true renaissance for the island nation, reflecting the confidence of a newly secured realm. This new confidence wasn't confined to England's shores. The spirit of adventure soared as English mariners dared to challenge the established powers on the high seas. Men like Sir Francis Drake became national heroes. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, returning with his ship, the Golden Hind, laden with Spanish treasure. He and others like him, often called sea dogs, were part pirate, part explorer, and all patriot. They raided Spanish colonies and treasure fleets, enriching England and thumbing their noses at King Philip. At the same time, men like Sir Walter Raleigh dreamed of empire. He sponsored expeditions to the New World, attempting to establish English colonies, most famously at Roanoke. Though these early attempts failed, they were a sign of what was to come. The foundations of a global empire were being quietly, yet ambitiously laid, fueled by a desire for both riches and prestige. England, under Elizabeth, had found its stride, enjoying a period of confidence and unprecedented growth. The Virgin Queen had become a living legend, Gloriana, the symbol of her nation's triumph. Yet, even in her golden years, the Queen remained isolated in her personal life. The very choices that secured her reign, her refusal to marry, her devotion to her country above all else, so ensured a poignant, private solitude. As she aged, the question she had avoided her entire life, the question of her succession, would re-emerge, casting a long, complex shadow over her remaining years. Our next chapter delves into the personal cost of the crown. For Elizabeth, the crown was not merely an adornment. It was her life, her passion, her very identity. She famously declared herself married to England. This unwavering dedication, however, came at a profound personal cost. The Virgin Queen, so public in her devotion to her realm, remained intensely private in her heart, a solitude born of political necessity and personal sacrifice. From the moment she took the throne, the clamor for Elizabeth to marry was relentless. You have to understand, for her parliament and her council, an unmarried, childless queen was a crisis waiting to happen. What if she died suddenly? The succession would be thrown into chaos, potentially plunging England back into the civil war and religious strife she had worked so hard to end. So they begged her, they petitioned her, they demanded she choose a husband and produce an heir. The list of suitors was long and distinguished. There was King Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, who proposed marriage early in her reign. There were the Archdukes of Austria. There was the handsome but erratic Duke of Anjou from France, a courtship that dragged on for years in her middle age. She treated it all like a masterful diplomatic game. She would hint at accepting one proposal to gain an advantage with that country, then entertain another to keep her options open. She kept all of Europe guessing for decades. Yet, with a political genius unmatched, she transformed this intense pressure into a diplomatic weapon, skillfully parrying suitors and maintaining her independence, though at a deeply personal price. But while she played politics with foreign princes, her heart belonged to one man, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. He was her childhood friend. They had known each other since they were children, had even been imprisoned in the Tower of London at the same time under Queen Mary. He was handsome, dashing, and he understood her in a way no one else did. He was her sweet Robin, her constant companion. The court buzzed with rumors about them. Did they love each other? Almost certainly. Were they lovers? We will never know. For a time, it seemed a marriage between them might be possible. But then, a dark scandal erupted that made it impossible. Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs in her country home with her neck broken. An inquest ruled her death an accident, but the whispers were poisonous. Had Dudley arranged his wife's death so he would be free to marry the Queen? Even if he was completely innocent, the scandal was too great. For Elizabeth to marry him then would have destroyed her reputation and possibly cost her the throne. Her heart, however, found its closest companion in Robert Dudley. Their bond was deep, complex, and filled with rumor and longing. Yet the demands of the throne and the shadow of scandal forever placed an insurmountable barrier between personal desire and queenly duty, leaving Elizabeth to choose England above all else. Dudley eventually remarried, and though they remained close friends until his death, the moment for personal happiness had passed. As Elizabeth grew older, the cost of her choices became more apparent. The great figures of her reign, The men she had relied upon for decades began to die off. First Walsingham, then Dudley, her love, and finally her rock, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. She was left surrounded by a new generation of ambitious young courtiers who hadn't shared in the struggles of her early reign. The weight of the crown, which she had borne for so long, must have felt heavier than ever. We see glimpses of the human woman beneath the powerful monarch, her legendary temper, her moments of deep sadness, her vanity about her aging appearance, despite her triumphs. Elizabeth's later years were marked by a profound solitude. The very strength that defined her reign also created a personal isolation, as the weight of the crown denied her the comforts of a conventional life, leaving her to bear the immense burden alone. Elizabeth's personal sacrifices cemented her legend, but the very issue she had so long avoided, the succession, would loom larger than ever as her reign drew to a close. The figure who would ultimately inherit her throne was none other than the son of her greatest rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. How would this unlikely heir, raised by Protestant Scottish lords, bridge the chasm between two royal houses? Our next chapter focuses on the young King James VI, while his mother languished in English captivity, and his formidable cousin reigned in splendor. A young boy in Scotland was being meticulously shaped for a destiny far greater than his rugged homeland. James VI, son of the executed Mary Queen of Scots, was a product of paradox. Raised by Protestant lords, yet heir to a Catholic martyr. King of a turbulent nation, yet destined to unite the crowns of Great Britain. His unique upbringing would define his future. He was crowned King of Scots when he was just 13 months old, a baby in a coronation robe, unable to comprehend the weight of the crown placed upon his head. He grew up not knowing his mother's touch or his father's face. His world was the stark, cold stone of Stirling Castle. His guardians were the very Protestant lords who had overthrown his Catholic mother. His primary tutor, a brilliant but severe scholar named George Buchanan, despised Mary, and taught the young king that she was a tyrant and an adulteress. James received a world-class education, becoming fluent in Latin, French, and Greek. He was deeply intelligent, a true scholar who would later write books on theology, witchcraft, and the divine right of kings. Crowned in infancy, James VI grew up a king without a queenly mother, shaped by the austere lessons of Protestant tutors. He became an intellectual monarch, viewing himself as a philosopher king, a stark contrast to the turbulent life of his impetuous mother. Mary's tragic life and execution cast a long shadow over her son. For years, she was a distant figure, a name in letters, a mother he could never meet. When Elizabeth signed her death warrant, James was a young man of 20. All of Catholic Europe looked to him, expecting him to raise an army to avenge his mother's death. But James was a pragmatist. He understood the Game of Thrones better than most. He knew his mother's death, while a personal tragedy had removed the single biggest obstacle between him and the English crown. To wage war on Elizabeth would be to throw away the greatest inheritance in Europe. So he made a formal, angry protest, and then he did nothing. While he may have grieved her fate, James was acutely aware that any open challenge to Elizabeth would jeopardize the very prize his mother had so desperately sought, the throne of England. He learned to play a long, patient game. As Elizabeth's reign drew to a close, a subtle, yet crucial, correspondence began between the two monarchs. The aging queen, now in her 60s, knew she needed to ensure a stable Protestant succession. James was the only viable candidate. He was Protestant, he was an experienced king, and he was the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII, giving him a direct, legitimate blood claim. Yet, Elizabeth refused to ever officially name him as her heir. She famously said she would not make her winding sheet her everyday dress. She feared that if she named a successor, her courtiers would abandon the setting sun and flock to the rising sun. So, the communication was done in secret, often through Elizabeth's sharp and capable chief minister, Robert Cecil. James, for his part, was a master of diplomacy. He wrote flattering, respectful letters to Elizabeth. He was patient. He waited. James, through careful diplomacy, patiently solidified his position as the most obvious and acceptable heir to the Tudor throne, a testament to his political foresight. The son of the rival queen was now poised to become the successor, a strange twist of fate born from decades of bitter conflict. As Elizabeth's long reign approached its natural end, the question of the central preoccupation of her court and the legacy of the great rivalry would lead to an unprecedented union. What final challenges would confront Elizabeth, and how would her passing mark the dawn of a new era for Great Britain? Our next chapter explores the twilight of her reign. Even the most brilliant stars eventually begin to dim. After decades of unparalleled triumph, Elizabeth's final years were tinged with a growing melancholia. The burdens of an aging monarch, the loss of her most trusted advisers, and the unresolved questions of succession cast a long, wistful shadow over what had once been a golden age. The glorious reign was drawing to its quiet, poignant close. The pillars of her reign began to fall. One by one, the faces she had known her entire life, the men who had guided her through crisis after crisis, were gone. Her spy master, Walsingham, her great love, Robert Dudley. And then, in 1598, the biggest blow of all, her chief minister, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, died. For 40 years, he had been her rock, her steady hand, her spirit, as she called him. His death left a void that could never be filled. She was left increasingly isolated, relying on a new generation of courtiers. These were ambitious, swaggering young men who had not lived through the dangers of her early reign. They jostled for power and favor, and none more so than Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He was handsome, charming, and reckless. He was the stepson of her beloved Robert Dudley, and for a time he became the aging queen's favorite. She doted on him, but also despaired at his arrogance and ambition. Their relationship was stormy, a mix of affection and frustration. Even in her twilight, the challenges persisted. A costly, drawn-out war in Ireland drained her treasury and her spirit. The Irish lord, Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, led a massive rebellion that dragged on for years. A bloody and expensive conflict that the English struggled to win. Elizabeth sent her favorite, Essex, to Ireland to crush the rebellion. It was a disaster. He failed to achieve a decisive victory, and then, against the Queen's explicit orders, he abandoned his post and returned to England to confront her. This act of defiance was the beginning of the end for him. Stripped of his offices and banished from court, the desperate Essex made one last, fatal gamble. In 1601, he tried to raise the city of London in rebellion against the Queen's government. The plot failed miserably. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and found guilty. For Elizabeth, it was a heartbreaking betrayal. This was a man she had loved like a son, but she was a queen first. Just as she had signed the death warrant for her cousin Mary, she now had to sign the death warrant for her last great favorite. He was executed in the Tower of London. It is said that Elizabeth wept for him, and a shadow fell over her that never truly lifted. As the Queen's health faded, the question she had so skillfully avoided throughout her reign became paramount. Everyone at court knew the end was near, and still she refused to name her successor. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun with her grandfather, would end with her. Behind the scenes, Lord Burleigh's son, the shrewd and capable Robert Cecil, worked feverishly to ensure a peaceful succession. He maintained a secret, coded correspondence with King James of Scotland, making all the necessary preparations for a smooth transition of power. He was preparing for a future that his queen refused to speak of. In her final months, Elizabeth withdrew into a deep depression. She stood for hours, staring into space, refusing to go to bed, convinced that if she lay down, she would never get up again. Her ladies in waiting laid cushions on the floor for her to rest upon. The legendary strength, the fierce will that had defined her for so long, was finally failing. The end of an era was at hand. The extraordinary life of Elizabeth Tudor was drawing to its end, an era of unprecedented strength and triumph, yet marked by profound personal sacrifice and the shadow of a lifelong rivalry. Her death would mark the true end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter for Great Britain, shaped by the son of the very woman she had executed. Our final chapter brings us to the moment of her passing and the lasting legacies of both queens. On a cold March morning in 1603, the last of the Tudors passed into history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, breathed her last, ending an era that had defined England for over 40 years. Her death, however, was not the end of a kingdom, but the dawn of a new one, a peaceful transition that would see the crowns of England and Scotland finally united, a resolution born, ironically, from the bitter rivalry of two formidable queens. In the final days at Richmond Palace, the great queen was a shadow of her former self. The grief over Essex, the weight of her long reign, and the frailty of her aging body had finally taken their toll. For days, she refused to go to bed, propped up on cushions on the floor, her counselors and ladies in waiting, watching helplessly. She remained silent, lost in her thoughts, the formidable spirit of Elizabeth finally preparing to leave her body. In the early hours of March 24th, she passed away quietly. The moment the court had dreaded for nearly half a century had arrived. But there was no chaos, there was no civil war. The meticulous, secret planning of Robert Cecil paid off. The Queen's Council met immediately. Within hours, a proclamation was read out across London, declaring that the new monarch of England was King James VI of Scotland. The transition of power was swift, orderly, and peaceful, a final testament to the stability Elizabeth had so painstakingly built over her long and glorious reign. A rider was dispatched, galloping north as fast as his horse could carry him. He rode for days, finally arriving at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh to bring the news to James. The prize his mother had died for, the prize he had patiently waited for his entire adult life, was finally his. From the rugged north, King James I of England and VI of Scotland embarked on a triumphant ceremonial journey to his new capital. It was a slow, grand procession. He was greeted by cheering crowds in every town he passed through. For them, he was a symbol of continuity and peace. For James, it was the fulfillment of his destiny. He arrived in the far wealthier, more powerful kingdom of England, eager to embrace his grand inheritance. bringing with him a vision of a truly united Great Britain, a single island under one sovereign, a dream born out of centuries of division. The accession of James I marked the unprecedented union of the crowns, a profound moment in British history. For the first time, England and Scotland, two nations that had been rivals and enemies for centuries, shared a single king. While they would keep their own separate parliaments, laws, and churches for another 100 years, this was the beginning of the end of that division. Think of it, the entire decades-long struggle between Elizabeth and Mary, the plots, the imprisonment, the execution, all of it had been driven by the question of who would sit on England's throne. And in the end, the person who sat on that throne was Mary's son. The bitter rivalries and bloody conflicts of centuries were finally set aside, as the two kingdoms shared a single head, a peace forged from the very legacy of the queens who had once so fiercely contended. The age of Elizabeth and Mary had drawn to a close, but their intertwined legacies continued to shape the new Stuart era. The personal struggles and political ambitions of these two extraordinary queens ultimately led to a union that reshaped the destiny of a nation. But beyond the crown, what lasting mark did these powerful women leave on history? And how do their complex stories continue to resonate in our understanding of leadership and power? We now turn to explore the profound and enduring legacies of Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. Even centuries after her death, the image of Elizabeth I, Gloriana, continues to shine brightly, a testament to a reign that defied expectations and shaped a nation. Her legacy is not merely one of survival against the odds, but of actively forging a strong, independent, and culturally vibrant England. What indelible marks did the Virgin Queen leave on the course of history, and how did her unique approach to power resonate through the ages? When Elizabeth took the throne, she inherited a kingdom fractured by religious hatred, financially weak, and dismissed on the world stage. When she died, she left behind a nation that was more stable, more prosperous, and more confident than it had ever been. Her first and perhaps greatest achievement was bringing a measure of peace to the religious wars that had torn England apart. The Elizabethan religious settlement, her middle way for the Church of England, was a masterstroke of political compromise. It didn't please the most extreme Catholics or the most radical Protestants, but it satisfied the vast majority in the middle. It ended the burnings at the stake and allowed England to heal. Elizabeth bequeathed to England a precious gift, an era of stable governance after decades of turmoil. Her shrewd political instincts ensured that the crown, while strong, did not overtly challenge the traditional structures, paving the way for a unified and resilient state. Under Elizabeth, England found its voice and its strength on the world stage. For years, it had been a second-rate power, overshadowed by the might of Spain and France. The defeat of the Spanish Armada changed everything. It was more than a military victory. It was a profound psychological moment. It proved that little England could stand up to the greatest power in Europe and win. This triumph ignited a fierce sense of national identity and pride. It fueled a new age of adventure. Her sea dogs, like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, sailed to the far corners of the globe, challenging Spanish dominance on the seas and laying the very first foundations for what would one day become the British Empire. The daring ventures of her mariners set England on a course to become a dominant global power. And of course, there is the culture. The stability and prosperity of Elizabeth's reign created the conditions for an incredible flowering of the arts. This was the age of Shakespeare, a time when the English language itself seemed to reach new heights of beauty and power. The theaters of London came alive with timeless stories of kings, lovers, and tragic heroes. Poets and musicians created works that defined an era, and Elizabeth herself was at the center of it all. She was highly educated, a lover of music and theater, and a patron of the arts. The cultural vibrancy of Elizabeth's reign was truly extraordinary. From the soaring poetry to the timeless plays, England experienced an explosion of creativity, a golden age that forever etched her name alongside the greatest patrons and leaders in history. Her image as the strong, independent Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom, became a powerful and enduring symbol of England itself. Elizabeth's legacy is one of triumph and enduring impact. But what of her tragic rival, Mary? Despite her tumultuous life and violent end, Mary, Queen of Scots, also left a profound, albeit different, mark on history, one rooted in martyrdom and a continuing claim to legitimacy. How would the memory of the martyred queen continue to resonate, especially through her powerful son? Our next chapter explores Mary's poignant and persistent legacy. Though her life ended tragically on the scaffold, Mary, Queen of Scots, cast a remarkably long shadow. Her legacy, one of pathos, defiance, and enduring historical debate. For centuries, she has been portrayed as a romantic figure, a victim of political machinations, and a Catholic martyr. What lasting mark did this enigmatic queen leave, and how did her very suffering influence the future of the British Isles? While Elizabeth's legacy is one of political triumph and national glory, Mary's is far more personal, more emotional, and in many ways, more tragic. Her execution, the deliberate killing of an anointed Catholic queen by a Protestant rival, instantly transformed her story. The messy details of her life, the disastrous marriages, the scandals, the political failures, began to fade. What remained was the powerful image of her final moments, the black dress giving way to the blood red of martyrdom, her dignified prayer, her final defiant stand for her faith. In death, Mary found a new, powerful role. For millions, particularly in Catholic Europe, her execution transformed her into a sacred martyr, a symbol of defiance against Protestant heresy, her image immortalized in ballads and art. She became a symbol of the old faith, unjustly persecuted, a story that resonated deeply in an age of religious conflict. And then there is the greatest, most profound irony of her entire story. The ultimate irony of Mary's life lies in her progeny. It was through her son, James, that the long-contested crowns of England and Scotland finally united. Elizabeth, the victor, the survivor, died childless, ending the Tudor line. It was Mary, the vanquished, the executed prisoner, whose bloodline inherited everything. Her lifelong ambition, the one that drove her rivalry with Elizabeth and ultimately led to her death, was to see a Stuart on the English throne. In the end, that ambition was fulfilled. Her execution removed her as a divisive Catholic alternative, paradoxically making it easier for Elizabeth's government to accept her Protestant son as the heir. Her tragic path, in a strange twist of fate, paved the way for the very union she had so desperately sought. In this, you could say, Mary had the final victory. This dramatic, tragic quality is why Mary's story has never lost its power to fascinate. Mary's life, filled with passion and tragedy, has captivated storytellers for centuries. She is the quintessential romantic heroine, beautiful, charming, caught up in forces beyond her control. Her story has been told and retold in plays, operas, novels, and countless films. We are drawn to her passionate and often reckless choices, her love affairs, her daring escape from Loch Leven Castle. She feels more human, more relatable in her flaws than the formidable, untouchable Elizabeth. And the great question of her life, was she a willing accomplice in her husband Darnley's murder, or a naive victim of ruthless men, remains a subject of intense debate. This ambiguity, the fact that we can never truly know, ensures her place in the popular imagination. She remains an endlessly fascinating and often romanticized figure. Mary's complex legacy, intertwined with martyrdom and destiny, provides a powerful contrast to Elizabeth's triumph. Their individual impacts were undeniable, yet it was their bitter rivalry, the constant tension and political maneuvering, that truly defined an era and set the stage for profound change. In our next chapter, we will directly compare the leadership styles and personalities that fueled this historic conflict, examining what made them such formidable, yet ultimately destructive, foils to each other. They were cousins, queens, and rivals, yet their approaches to power and life could not have been more different. Elizabeth, the cautious survivor, and Mary, the impetuous romantic. Their clash was not merely one of religion or dynastic claim, but of fundamentally opposing temperaments, each with their own strengths and fatal flaws. What insights can we glean from comparing the contrasting leadership styles of these two iconic women? At its core, their rivalry was a battle of the head versus the heart. Elizabeth ruled with her head, her difficult childhood being declared illegitimate. Her mother's execution, her imprisonment in the Tower, had taught her to be cautious, to trust no one completely, and to put survival above all else. Every decision was a careful calculation. She saw her potential marriage not as a matter of love, but as a diplomatic chessboard. She delayed, she equivocated, she compromised. She put the stability of her kingdom before any personal feeling. Mary, on the other hand, ruled with her heart. Raised in the luxury and romance of the French court, she was passionate, impulsive, and believed deeply in her own destiny. She fell in love with the handsome Darnley and married him against all political advice. When that soured, she threw in her lot with the reckless Bothwell, an act of passion that cost her the throne. One was a master of political calculation, navigating treacherous waters with caution and cunning. The other, driven by emotion and fierce conviction, often found herself at the mercy of her own heart. This fundamental difference in temperament defined their reigns and fueled their rivalry. This difference in temperament showed in how they governed. Elizabeth commanded a loyal and efficient government, carefully balancing power and nurturing talent. She inherited her father's gift for choosing brilliant ministers. Like William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, these men were loyal not just to her, but to the idea of a strong and stable England. She listened to their counsel, even when she disagreed, and she masterfully managed the factions at her court. She knew how to project an image of power. Her famous progresses around the country were exercises in brilliant public relations, connecting her to her people. Mary, however, faced constant challenges from her turbulent Scottish nobility. The Scottish lords were powerful, clannish, and fiercely independent. They did not bow easily to royal authority, especially from a queen who had spent her youth in France and was of a different faith. She struggled to build a loyal inner circle, often relying on a small group of favorites, which only increased the jealousy and resentment of the other nobles. Her court was a place of conspiracy and violence, as the shocking murder of her secretary Rizzio demonstrated. She was never able to master the treacherous politics of her own kingdom. And nowhere was this contrast clearer than in the two issues that defined their entire rivalry: religion and succession. Both queens grappled with the burning issues of faith and lineage, but with starkly different outcomes. Elizabeth's approach was political. Her religious settlement was a masterpiece of compromise, designed not to create a perfect church, but a peaceful kingdom. Her famous ambiguity on the succession was also a political tool. By refusing to name an heir, she kept her own power secure and prevented her court from flocking to a rising sun. For Elizabeth, these were problems to be managed. For Mary, they were matters of absolute principle. She was devoutly Catholic, and she refused to compromise her faith, even when it made her an outsider in her own Protestant country. And her claim to the English throne was, in her eyes, a divine right given to her at birth. She would never bargain it away, never renounce it. She asserted it publicly, embroidering the English coat of arms on her banners, a direct and dangerous provocation. This inflexibility, this refusal to compromise on what she saw as her sacred rights, would ultimately lead to her undoing. The clash of these two extraordinary women, so different in their approaches, ultimately defined an era of profound change for Britain. Their personal rivalry, born of blood and ambition, served as a catalyst for a series of events that forever altered the relationship between England and Scotland. But beyond the crown and court, what were the long-term reverberating consequences of this specific rivalry on the course of history itself? Our next chapter explores the broader historical impact of their conflict. The story of Elizabeth and Mary is more than a personal drama. It's a crucible from which the modern British state began to emerge. Their rivalry, fueled by religious division and dynastic claims, had profound ripple effects, shaping not just the immediate future of England and Scotland, but laying crucial foundations for the centuries that followed. How did this conflict become a turning point in the history of a nation? Paradoxically, the constant threat that Mary represented actually made Elizabeth's government stronger. For decades, Mary was the living, breathing alternative to Elizabeth's rule. She was a magnet for every plot, every conspiracy, and every disgruntled Catholic in the kingdom. This persistent danger forced Elizabeth's government, led by men like Cecil and Walsingham, to become incredibly efficient. They built a sophisticated spy network, centralized power, and developed a powerful propaganda machine to promote loyalty to the Queen. The relentless pressure exerted by Mary and her Catholic supporters, ironically, served to strengthen Elizabeth's grip on power and rally England around her Protestant monarchy. The nation, united against a common threat, became more cohesive and resilient than ever before. Protestantism became more than just a religion. It became a key part of English national identity, a symbol of defiance against foreign Catholic powers. And most significantly, the rivalry between these two queens, driven by their competing claims to the same throne, ultimately paved the way for the peaceful unification of the English and Scottish crowns. For centuries, England and Scotland had been separate, often hostile, kingdoms. The fact that Mary, a Scottish queen, had such a strong claim to the English throne kept the two nations deeply intertwined. Her execution, and the subsequent peaceful accession of her Protestant son, James, was the final, ironic resolution to their long struggle. It was a historical irony that their bitter personal conflict led to an unprecedented dynastic resolution. The union of the crowns in 1603 when James became king of both realms, was the first crucial step toward the creation of the single entity of Great Britain. Their rivalry didn't just shape Britain, it had a major impact on all of Europe. In the 16th century, Europe was torn apart by the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. The struggle between Elizabeth and Mary became a focal point for this larger conflict. Catholic Spain, led by King Philip II, saw Mary as the rightful Queen of England and supported plots to put her on the throne. Protestant nations saw Elizabeth as their champion. Their rivalry transcended borders, becoming a critical battleground in the European religious wars. England, under Elizabeth, was forced to take a leading role, emerging as a formidable Protestant power. The long, undeclared war with Spain, culminating in the defeat of the Armada, was a direct consequence of this tension. The conflict between these two women helped to draw the map of a new, religiously divided Europe. The echoes of Elizabeth and Mary's rivalry continue to resonate, shaping our understanding of monarchy, power, and faith. Their story is a powerful reminder of the human drama at the heart of historical change. As we draw to a close, let us reflect on the enduring lessons and the timeless allure of their entwined destinies. What final thoughts can we offer on these two captivating queens, whose lives, though tragically separated, were forever bound by the glittering, perilous prize of a crown? Our final chapter offers a concluding reflection. As our journey through the lives of Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, comes to a close, we are left not just with a tale of two queens, but with a profound reflection on the nature of power, faith, and human destiny. Their rivalry, so intensely personal, yet so grand in its historical scope, continues to offer valuable lessons, a timeless mirror reflecting the complexities of leadership and the enduring struggle for survival. Their story is, above all, a powerful testament to the crushing weight of a crown, especially when worn by a woman in an age dominated by men. Both Elizabeth and Mary were expected to marry, to produce heirs, and to defer to male counsel. Yet both, in their own ways, defied these expectations. Elizabeth did so by consciously rejecting marriage, crafting an identity as the Virgin Queen, married to her people. Mary did so by marrying for passion and asserting her own authority, often with disastrous results. Their lives remind us of the profound sacrifices demanded of those who rule, the constant scrutiny, the endless political maneuvering, the lack of anyone to truly trust. Both Elizabeth and Mary bore the crushing weight of the crown, each in their own way demonstrating the profound sacrifices demanded of those who rule. Their lives serve as a poignant reminder that even the most glittering of positions comes with immense burdens and often profound loneliness. Their rivalry was also a showcase for the power of belief and the power of image. Faith, fiercely held, was a defining force in their lives, shaping the loyalties that rallied around them and the conflicts they endured. Elizabeth's Protestantism became synonymous with English nationalism and independence. Mary's Catholicism became the banner for all who wished to challenge that new order. And in a world without mass media, the careful cultivation of image and the power of propaganda proved as vital a weapon as any army. Elizabeth's team crafted the image of Gloriana, the semi-divine queen, eternally youthful and wise. Mary, in her final years, and especially after her death, was crafted into the image of a Catholic martyr, a beautiful and tragic saint. These powerful images have shaped how we see them for over 400 years. So why does their story continue to captivate us? Why do we return again and again to this tale of two queens? Perhaps it is because their story resonates, because it is profoundly human. It is a story of family rivalry played out on the grandest possible stage. It speaks to ambition, betrayal, love, loss, and the relentless pursuit of power, all against the backdrop of an era that redefined nations. We see the universal human emotions in their letters, their decisions, their triumphs, and their tragedies. Their lives, though centuries past, feel strikingly immediate in their drama. We can understand Elizabeth's fear and indecision, and we can understand Mary's pride and passion. And so, the epic saga of Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, finds its tranquil close. To queens bound by blood, divided by destiny. One, through caution and political genius, ensured the survival and flourishing of a strong, independent England. The other, through tragedy and an unyielding belief in her own rights, ironically ensured the future of the British crown would pass to her own son, uniting two kingdoms. Their personal rivalry, a dark and often bitter chapter, ultimately forged a new destiny for the island nation. Their story reminds us that even in the quiet of the night, the echoes of history's most compelling figures continue to unfold, weaving a rich tapestry of power, faith, and the enduring human spirit. Thank you so much for joining us on this long journey through one of history's greatest rivalries. If you've enjoyed settling in and listening to this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us to continue creating these long-form histories for you. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on Elizabeth and Mary in the comments below. As you drift into a peaceful slumber, may the grand narratives of the past continue to inspire and intrigue you. Join us again for another nighttime history journey.